What are we going to do about it? It's a question Joe Madison asks every day. It is what is required of anyone who is participating in Urban View, which is talk that empowers and requires action of you. You have to do something if you listen to the show. And what I'm going to ask you to all to do is to check out this new documentary, Who We Are, a Chronicle of Racism in America. Joining me right now is the creator of this wonderful project. And I think the Kutzlers are also involved, William Kutzler's daughters, but we're going to talk about that in a second. Let me welcome attorney and CEO of the Who We Are Project, Jeffery Robinson. Welcome to the Karen Hunter Show.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Man, it's almost kismet, because this year I've said I'm going to commit myself to a couple of things. And one of the areas is to dismantle whiteness. Well, I don't say that out loud, but I just said it out loud. We need to erase this notion that there's something inherently different about people without a whole lot of melanin and people that are melanated. And there has to be a conversation around infusing the people with melanin with their knowledge of self, so that we can combat this thing head on without centering the thing. So no more conversation about white supremacy. No, it's mediocrity and fear, nationalism. That's what we're dealing with. There's no supremacy, because if you're supreme, you don't have to behave this way, and there's no difference. We're species, we're all human beings. So how do we get here? You started with this story arc of all of this progress. Yesterday was a holiday that we celebrated. Arizona gave up the ghost, and now we celebrate Martin Luther King Day. But to me, it was hollow, because we celebrate King. We got Maya Angelou on a quarter. We're out here with Juneteenth as a holiday, but we can't get voting rights. We can't have a discussion about reparations. No. Keep your symbolic gestures and let's, get busy, or else. Because what we do have is we do have voting might, and we do have economic power when we use it collectively. What was the impetus to doing Who We Are, and what do you want us to walk away with?
The impetus in doing this film came from circumstances in my family where my nephew, who lived in New York, lost his mother and his grandmother, who were raising him. And my wife, it was her sister and her mother as well. And so our 13-year-old nephew became our 13-year-old son. And he moved from New York to Memphis. And all of a sudden, I had no kids. And then I had this 13-year-old young Black man in my house. And I was terrified about my responsibility for raising him. And as I started to read, looking for help in any area I could find, I started finding stuff about the history of, and I will use the term, and let me explain why, white supremacy and anti-Black racism in the United States history. I started finding this stuff that I had never seen before. And I have one of the best educations in America, Marquette University and Harvard Law School. And yet in my 50s, I was reading stuff that I had never seen. And I became humiliated. I didn't read about the civil rights movement. I grew up in the middle of it. My older brother and I integrated a Catholic school in Memphis, Tennessee in 1963. So there's no excuse for me not knowing this information that I was finding. And after feeling humiliated and angry at myself, I finally said, I got to get past this. So I needed somebody else to blame. So I figured I'll blame my teachers. But then I thought, well, how am I going to blame them for teaching me something that they weren't taught? And I started to I really wonder how many Americans know what really was behind the formation of this country and how deeply it ran through the country's history. And so I started doing a presentation that was 3 hours long about this history, the history that, in my view, is hiding in plain sight, but a history that we have tried to erase completely. And in April of 2017, Sarah Kutzler, daughter of civil rights lawyer William Kutzler, who is a criminal defense lawyer, saw a presentation that I gave. And a couple months later, she and her sister Emily, they're both filmmakers, as well as Sarah being a lawyer, they took me to have coffee. And they had coffee and I had hot chocolate. And they said, we want to film your presentation and get it to the widest audience possible. And I laughed And we figured out that was June 20th, 2017. And on Juneteenth, June 19th, 2018, we were in Town Hall Theater in New York with a packed house and 7 cameras, and we filmed a version of the presentation. And from there, we went on to complete the documentary film.
Jeffrey Robinson, what was the first shocking story that sent you down the rabbit hole?
I think I've been asked that question a number of times, and I think every single thing that I was uncovering was like a punch in the stomach or a slap in the face. And so it's hard to single out like one thing, but what I can say is that throughout the existence of human beings on this planet, when we think we're doing something important, we write stuff down. And this goes back to the cave drawings. There's an old band from the 70s called Steely Dan, and they had a song called The Caves of Altamira. And one of the lyrics was, before the fall, when they wrote it on the wall, when there wasn't even any Hollywood. They were drawing pictures of the animals they hunted, the tracks the animals left, their tribe hunting the animals. They were using narrative to explain the world to their other tribe members. And so so before there was even written language, human beings have been writing stuff down when we do important things. The Constitutional Convention was a really important thing. We were forming a country. And so the people who were founding the country wrote down what they thought. And slavery was right on the table because the colonies had been enriching themselves with chattel slavery. And so the founders of the country wrote what they thought. And that blew the top of my head off because it's some of the most virulent white supremacist language that you have ever heard.
Give us some. Let us hear it. Because, Jeffrey Robinson, I started during the pandemic a conversation with, at the time, the head of Africana Studies at Howard, Dr. Greg Carr. And I remember the first thread that was pulled from me. And I wasn't angry. I was grateful because the rabbit hole that it sent me down freed me because, I've always known that our history didn't start 1619, actually didn't start 1619. And that there was something always wrong with that Phyllis Wheatley, every Black History Month, Phyllis Wheatley, and that poem about the Dark Continent. It never sat well with me as a child because I was like, how can that dark continent also give us science and math? Because my father taught me that, right? How is that a dark continent when all civilization, aqueducts, everything was founded in Africa? Those pyramids they can't even duplicate. How is that a dark continent? And if it's such a dark continent, why did you need these people to build your new world? I didn't understand, it was incongruent with actual fact. So then you bring forward the founding fathers who wrote, everything from the 3/5 Compromise to putting into the status of the child following the status of the mother in law, right? And as a lawyer, you understand.
In Virginia, the child of an enslaved mother is an enslaved being. Why did they need that law? Because white men were systematically raping the Black women that they quote unquote owned. And the law wanted to make sure, in case those babies came out with freckles or blue eyes, don't go thinking that's a person. That's an enslaved person. That is how particular the law was about infusing into American life, colonial American life, this concept that people with less melanin in their skin were somehow superior, were on a different level of humanity than people that look like you and me. And so, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Just take it back even further in Virginia, because there was a bond being formed between the Irish indentured and the enslaved Africans that then forced this thing called whiteness into existence, right? In order to keep the chasm and keep the money coming, keep the flowing, because you don't want people coming together. So you have to build something or build a wedge, and then whiteness was invented. Like even that is not taught anywhere, right? And now today we're having this debate. It's not even a debate. You got Virginia, a whole governor, banning critical race theory that's never been taught any place but law school from public school. Like it is insane where we are right now.
Well, I mean, if you want to think about insanity, every state that has an anti-CRT law, critical race theory law, and we have seen where some of those states have banned stuff written by Dr. King. And yesterday, the very same people that are behind those things are singing his praises. Now, what they like to say is, you know, judge me by the content of my character, not the color of my skin, and kind of statements like that, that are just wonderful statements that everybody can get behind. What they don't like to talk about is that in 1967, Dr. King said, yeah, I remembered that dream speech in 1963. At many points, that dream has turned into a nightmare. You don't see that a whole lot because people don't want to talk about who the real Martin Luther King was and what he was teaching from April 4th, 1967, when he gave a speech in Chicago, until April 4th, 1968, when he was shot down and murdered in my hometown of Memphis. So I think the history is where it's so important for people to understand, to answer this question. Why does America look like it does today? When you look at white America and Black America, and you look at the gaps at virtually every point in societal living that you can think of, why do those gaps exist? Now, Jared Kushner, at the end of the Trump administration, said the problem is President Trump wants Blacks to be successful, but he can't want them to be successful more than they want to be successful. So under that analysis, the fault is just with us. We just don't want it bad enough. And if we would get off of our butts and pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, it would be okay. And if your understanding of American history is that there was slavery, but it was stopped at the Civil War, and then there were some problems, but the Civil Rights Movement solved them all, and we've all been on a level playing field since then. If that's your understanding of American history, then you might be seduced by what Jared Kushner is saying. But if you knew the truth about American history, what Jared Kushner says is ridiculous. And you were talking about, you know, how what people were saying at the Constitutional Convention. Well, you remember Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. Well, this is what he had to say. He was concerned about the fact that Black men fought for the United States in the Revolutionary War, and some of them were made citizens as a result. And this is what he had to say. May Congress not say that every Black man must fight? Didn't we see a little bit of that in the last war? We were not so hard pushed as to make emancipation general, but acts of assembly passed that every slave who would go to the army should be free. In this situation, I see a great deal of the property of the people of Virginia in jeopardy, and their peace and tranquility gone. Now, the first time I read that, the top of my head blew off. I thought, wait a minute. This is not the Patrick Henry that I was taught about. You know, it was give me liberty, give me death. And here he is saying, you know, we got to make sure that these Black people don't get free, even if they do fight for us.
Give us more, Jeffrey Robinson.
James
And before
Madison.
James Madison, Dolly Madison's husband, the ice cream lady.
Right,
Dolly Madison,
founding father of the country, and in the last administration, on the Monday before they left office, they put out something called the 1776 report about quote unquote patriotic education. And they say that they comment on the fact that the word slave doesn't appear in the Constitution until the 13th Amendment, outlawing it for everyone except those convicted of a crime. And that's because some would say that, you know, and when you read letters and, you know, slave is an ugly word. James Madison said, I didn't want slave used in the Constitution because I did not want that document to reflect the fact that there could be property in men. And they say, and then there was a compromise. Well, here's what James Madison had to say to Patrick Henry when Patrick Henry was worried about Black people becoming free. Madison did write those words about we shouldn't let the document show that there could be property in men. But here's what he said was to Patrick Henry. I was struck with surprise when I heard Patrick Henry express himself alarmed with respect to the emancipation of slaves. There is no power to warrant it in that paper, the Constitution. If there be, I know it not. So he may not have wanted to admit in writing that there could be property in men, but he assured everyone else at the Constitutional Convention that there would be property in men. And then the Constitution itself made clear that there would be property in men. They didn't call those men and women slaves. They called them such persons. And so when you start to read this, you understand, oh my God. And my head was blowing off. And then when
James, hold on. Didn't James Madison own people?
Absolutely. 41 of the 56 people who signed the Declaration of Independence owned enslaved people. And that's why I say the people that founded this country did not have a problem with white supremacy and the institution of slavery. There were people against it. Absolutely they were. But you see what happened in the Constitution, and those people who were against it, what impact did they have? Article 1, Section 2, that's the 3/5 clause. And I think you mentioned that. But that wasn't about us only being worth 3/5 of a human being. That's what many people thought. No. Article 2, Section 1 set up the Electoral College. And the Electoral College is determined by how many residents, the number of votes you get in the Electoral College, just like Congress, how many residents you have in the state. One of the things Patrick Henry complained about was 236,000 Blacks in Virginia. Multiply that by 3/5. And how many seats do you add in Congress? And how many votes in the Electoral College? The Electoral College was created to give the South a guarantee, not that they could select the president, but that they would have a major say in who was president. And did it work? 9 of the first 12 presidents were from the South, and 7 of those 9 were from Virginia.
And 8 of them owned human beings. 866-801-8255.
And just not, it wasn't because it wasn't an issue. And the other thing I'll say about the Constitution.
So wait, before we get into that, and I want you to stick around because we're up against the clock. Jeffery Robinson is here. He is the former deputy legal director of the ACLU. So he's been fighting injustice for a long time. I don't know why you decided to go to Harvard Law School. Why did you go, to integrated Catholic school? It's like we do these things as Black people, wherever we are, to somehow say we're good enough. And we're doing a reading of Carter G. Woodson, who also got a PhD from Harvard after having, to start all over again because the 5th degree wasn't good enough and all the other degrees that he had. And then you realize I got miseducated. I paid for my own miseducation. Do you feel that you paid for your own miseducation?
I think we all have, because quite frankly, this stuff isn't being taught in Black schools. It's not like all Black people in America know this information, because we don't. We don't know our own history in this country, and that is not because we are ignorant or uninterested. It's because it has literally been erased. Why do you think there's all this, as you mentioned, the anti-CRT stuff, where parents of 4th graders are screaming at a school board meeting, don't teach my children stuff that they can't be taught until they get into law school? Why would parents be wasting their time screaming about that? It's because we're talking about an origin story. the origin story of America. And when you're asking people to reject an origin story, that's like, literally, that's like who we are, who we think we are. And our origin story is largely a myth. And so the beautiful thing is the truth is hiding, but it's hiding in plain sight.
When we come back, Anna, I'm asking you to stick around because I can't let you go without solutions. So I want you to not just ponder, but let's talk about how we dismantle. And I'm still struggling with the white supremacy. Can we eliminate that? Just like they erased history, let's set it straight. Let's set it correct. What is it? What can we do? Everyone listening, what can we do to start to unravel, dismantle? There's work to be done. Jeffrey, I want you to stick around and let's do this work. When we come back, Torrin Ellis will be joining us and we'll take calls as well. Jeffrey Robinson is here. Jeff_Robinson56 is where you can follow him. Jeffrey and I were having a conversation. We had a conversation in break as well. And I was like, I cannot believe you don't have that one thing that made you go, I spent all of this money, got all these degrees, and I didn't know this. So he did come up with something. So I need to hear this, Jeffrey Robinson.
So like many people in America who were taught that there were many reasons behind the Civil War, all kinds of reasons. And I knew that wasn't true, but I had never actually looked at what I said before. When people think they're doing something important, they write it down. Well, leaving the United States was something important. So states wrote down why they did it. This is one part of one paragraph of a 30-paragraph secession statement by the state of Texas. And when I read it, I thought, how can anyone say anything else? All white men are, and of right ought to be, entitled to equal civil and political rights. That the servitude of the African race as exists in these states is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator.
They brought God into this?
I read this and I thought, wait a minute, this is bullshit. I'm sorry, this can't be right. And so I went to the Texas Historical Society and I went to the original source document. And this is not the worst thing that they said. It was the thing that jumped out at me, because I've gone back and looked at the statement since then, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, why did I choose this paragraph? Because this paragraph is even worse. But this is the kind of language that was used in the secession statements, and we still today have people who are trying to teach that the Civil War was not about slavery, it was about something else. And they are desperate to have people believe that, because if we were willing to maim and murder thousands of people in defense of the institution of slavery, what does that say about us as a country?
Actually, it was the bloodiest, the most lives lost in any of the wars, right? So let me ask you this. Is it possible, 866-801-8255, that we now, and that they factored in the miseducation and the erasure of, so they factored in, like right now, there are books that are being banned, so that they're going to be children that will never read my friend Jerry Craft's book about the new kid. It is such a beautiful little book that just, they will never read Maya Angelou. They will never read Toni Morrison. They will never read anything that makes Black Boy Joy. They'll never read anything.
Virtually, I can't see everything, but many of the things on the shelf behind you will be banned in schools in states that have anti-CRT laws. This film will be banned in those schools. But I think the mistake people make is, you think children only learn in school?
Well, but for centuries, they have banned the information, or they've hidden it in plain sight, as you mentioned. Is it the responsibility of the people who have been bathed in ignorance to educate themselves? And the question that I asked before break was, what's the solution to this? You have a documentary, Who We Are, a Chronicle of Racism in America. So we get the chapter and verse layout of how we got here, but how do we unget here? What's
And
the solution?
I think that is the critical question. I'll say two things. Number one, I made this film with Sarah and Emily Kutzler, white women who are the daughters of the civil rights icon William Kutzler. And people have asked me, so why did you do that? And I could give a simple answer, which is they came to me after seeing my presentation and said, we want to make a film. But that's too simple. They are anti-racist white allies who understand that it is everyone's responsibility to reckon with and retrieve this history. This history was stolen from all of us, and it is everyone's responsibility to retrieve it. What is the solution? And I think the reason I left the ACLU, and I was in charge of their criminal justice reform and racial justice work, I left that job, not because I didn't think they were doing good work, but because I feel like this history has been erased and has been ignored in every single legislative, political, social movement that we have moved forward. And if you are ignorant of the history that brought you to this point, every single solution you come up with will fail. And the best example is people think we can solve the problem of George Floyd by passing a law saying police can't kneel on your neck. That won't solve what killed George Floyd. But
right, because there was an anti-chokehold law.
It's already on the books. And so, but if you are ignorant of the history of anti-Black racism in policing in America, then you might think that solution would work. But if you knew that there were reports written after Black uprisings, after Black people were murdered, Chicago 1919, Harlem 1935, Detroit 1967, Rodney King, LA 1992. There were commissions that were established after each of those incidents, and they all say the same thing about anti-Black racism. So if you are ignorant of that, then your solution to policing will fail. And the other example I'll give is HR 40. The bill before Congress for reparations for slavery and the vestiges of slavery, which have lasted up to and including until today. Many people say, that's ridiculous. We've never done that before. That's impossible. Well, in 1862, 9 months before he passed the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln paid $1 million in 1862 money to Washington, D.C. slave holders for lost property. We have already paid reparations for slavery. We just paid it to white people, to the slave owners. And the other thing that we did, and there are Japanese American activists who have been supporting HR 40 amazingly. In 1988, we paid Japanese Americans $1.6 billion for 3.5 years of imprisonment during World War II. Now, if it's $1.6 billion for 3.5 years of imprisonment, what is it for 256 years of slavery in colonial and constitutional America? So HR 40 is one of the most important pieces of legislation because it will establish a commission to examine this problem and give proposals to Congress for reparatory legislation. People say it's impossible. Happened in the city of Evanston. On people who were denied the ability to get housing, and they have started already to give reparations to some of those families. So when we say we can never do it, that won't work. Part of it is if you're ignorant of history that tells you, oh, yes, it can work. Oh, yes, you can do that. Then you are robbed of a weapon in this fight. I always tell people, if you're going to get in this fight, you need to be armed. I don't mean with guns. I mean with facts, so that you can confront these things and confront people where they live.